Welcome back, guys and gals. This is the History Chick, and today we will be discussing history's biggest what-ifs, part 2. What if I told you that the world you live in almost looked completely different? What if the United States never existed? What if World War III had already happened? What if the Roman Empire never fell? History is built on almost. Those tiny moments where one decision, one accident, or one wrong turn could have rewritten reality as we know it. Today, we're diving into some of the biggest what-ifs moments in history, the close calls and near misses that would have changed everything. And trust me, some of these will blow your mind. Oh, and before we get started, tell me in the comments, which historical what-if fascinates you the most? Tell me what you liked about the part 1 video. What if Christopher Columbus had never sailed in 1492? Would the Americas have remained undiscovered by Europe for decades, or even centuries? Would someone else have taken the helm of history? Let's dive into one of the biggest historical what-ifs of all time. Columbus wasn't the only European dreaming of a western sea route to Asia. The Portuguese had been sailing around Africa for years, and others in Spain, England, and France were growing more ambitious. So if Columbus hadn't convinced Ferdinand and Isabella, someone else likely would have stepped up. Maybe Amerigo, or John Cabot, or even the Portuguese would have beaten Spain to the punch. But timing matters. Without Columbus, Spain may have arrived late to the game. That could have flipped the entire balance of colonial power. Maybe Portugal or even England becomes the dominant colonial empire in the Americas. Spanish language and culture might not be as widespread. Imagine a Latin America where Portuguese or English is the dominant tongue, or even a North America colonized by a totally different power. Without Columbus, the Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of crops, animals, and diseases would have been delayed. That means tomatoes don't reach Italy, potatoes don't get to Ireland, and smallpox don't devastate native populations, at least not as early. The entire course of history, from agricultural to population growth, could have shifted. So would the world be better off without Columbus, or just different? It's a tangled web of possibilities. But one thing's for sure, history isn't just about what happened. Sometimes it's about imagining what didn't. What if Napoleon Bonaparte had won at Waterloo in 1815? Would Europe be under French rule today? Would democracy have taken a backseat to empire? Let's unpack what could have happened if Napoleon had snatched a victory from the jaws of defeat. Waterloo wasn't just a battle, it was the battle. After escaping exile on Elba, Napoleon rallied his forces for one last bid to reclaim Europe. But at Waterloo, the British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher shut him down. His defeat led to his final exile and the restoration of the European monarchies. But what if Napoleon had won? If he had crushed Wellington before the Prussians arrived, he might have forced Britain and the other powers to the negotiating table. The so-called Seventh Coalition could have splintered, allowing Napoleon to regain control over France and possibly much of Europe. A victorious Napoleon might have reshaped Europe into a more centralized, French-led empire. The Holy Alliance? Gone. The Congress of Vienna? Undone. Nationalist movements might have exploded sooner or been brutally suppressed. The world may never have seen the same revolutions in 1830 or 1848, or the rise of British dominance in the 19th century. Would Napoleon have built a lasting European empire, or just delayed the inevitable? Either way, if Waterloo had gone differently, the 19th century and maybe the entire modern world could have looked very different. What if the Tartarians were never defeated? But first, Who were they really? A powerful empire lost to time? A misunderstood chapter of history? Or something else entirely? The term Tartary was once used by Europeans to describe a vast region covering much of Central and Northern Asia, including parts of Siberia, Mongolia, and even into China. It was more a geographical label than a single unified empire. But over time, the idea of Tartary grew into legend. Some say that the Tartarians were descendants of the Mongols. Others tie them to lost civilizations, and modern fringe theories even suggest they were a highly advanced society erased from history. So, what if this powerful Tartarian civilization had never fallen? Imagine a thriving empire stretching across Asia with technology, culture, and influence to rival Europe. They could have resisted European expansion, held off Chinese dynasties, and maybe even established trade empires that reached into the Americas or the Middle East. A surviving Tartarian empire might have drastically changed global politics. Russian imperialism could have stopped cold. The balance of power in Asia would have been entirely different. No Soviet Union, maybe no British dominance in India. And if the Tartarians were as advanced as some legends claim, we might be living in a world shaped by their technology, their architecture, and their vision of civilization. Was Tartaria just a forgotten term on old maps or something more? And if they had survived, would we even recognize the world we live in today? What if the American Revolution had failed? No stars and stripes, no United States, just 13 colonies still under the British crown? What would that mean for democracy, global politics, and the rest of the world? The American colonies declared independence in 1776, but it was far from a guaranteed win. Britain had a powerful army and navy, and many colonists remaining loyal to the crown. If George Washington had lost just a few key battles, or if France hadn't joined the war, the rebellion might have been crushed. In this version of history, the revolution fizzles out. Washington is captured or killed. The Continental Congress is dissolved. The colonies remain British, maybe with more autonomy, but still under the king. And that means no United States of America as we know it. Without a successful American Revolution, the ripple effects would be massive. No U.S. Constitution to inspire France's Revolution. No beacon of democracy in the New World. The French Revolution might have never happened, or taken a darker turn. Latin American revolutions might be delayed or crushed. The idea of a democratic republic could have remained a fringe concept. Also, slavery might have ended earlier under British rule, as the empire abolished it in 1833. But indigenous nations? They may have been pushed aside just the same, or worse. And without U.S. expansion, would there be a Canada to Mexico mega colony ruled by Britain? Would the British Empire still dominate the globe today? A failed American revolution wouldn't just change one nation. It could have altered the course of democracy, global power, and modern identity itself. What would a world without America look like? It's a question that shakes the foundations of history. What if the Confederacy had won the Civil War? What if the United States split in two and slavery remained legal in half of it? Let's explore one of the darkest and most chilling what-ifs in American history. By 1861, the U.S. was at war with itself. 11 southern states broke away, forming the Confederate States of America, largely to protect the institution of slavery. After 4 brutal years, the Union prevailed, but it wasn't inevitable. If key battles like Gettysburg or Antietam had gone the other way, or if foreign powers like Britain or France had recognized the Confederacy, we could be looking at a very different map. In this alternate timeline, the Confederacy survives as an independent nation. Slavery continues, possibly expands. The United States, now fractured, loses its moral and economic momentum. Reconstruction never happens. Civil rights movements are delayed by decades, maybe even generations. And imagine two rival nations side by side with clashing ideologies. The Confederate States might become a pariah or form alliances with powers hostile to the Union. Would they have joined the Axis in World War II? Would they have collapsed under internal pressure or become a long-lasting apartheid-like regime? Without reunification, America never becomes a superpower. The civil rights movement as we know it never happens. Global influence shifts, maybe to Britain, maybe to Germany or Russia, and race relations in North America. Far worse, entrenched in state policy and everyday life. This isn't just a political divergence, it's a moral one. A Confederate victory would mean a prolonged chapter of suffering and inequality written into law. What if the Confederacy had won? The world would be colder, crueler, and far less free. Thankfully, it's a chapter of history that never came to pass. But the echoes of that conflict still shape us, and they remind us what was truly at stake. What if World War I had never happened? No trenches, no Franz Ferdinand, no global war to end all wars? How different would the 20th century and the entire modern world look without it? World War I began in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But that spark only lit a fuse that had been building for years. Rising nationalism, tangled alliances, and an arms race among Europe's great powers. Still, if cooler heads had prevailed, if the assassination hadn't happened, or if diplomacy had worked, the war might have been avoided. In a world without World War I, the old empires, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Ottoman, might have limped on longer. Europe could have remained a continent of monarchies, not republics. No Treaty of Versailles, meaning no crushing German resentment. So maybe no Hitler, no Nazis, and no World War II. The Soviet Union? Maybe it never rises, as the Russian Revolution was triggered by wartime chaos. The US might have stayed more isolated, and colonial empires like Britain and France might have lasted longer. Since World War I helped fuel independence movements across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Without World War I, the technological and social upheavals it triggered, from women in the workforce to rapid advancements in medicine, aviation, and warfare, may have come slower. But so would the trauma, the lost generation, and the scars etched across an entire century. And geopolitically, the balance of power would be wildly different. No Cold War, no United Nations, maybe even a delayed civil rights movement in the US. The modern world as we know it might be unrecognizable. World War I redrew the map, shattered empires, and set the stage for everything that followed. If it never happened, the 20th century might have been calmer, or it might have exploded in another way later. Because when tensions build long enough, something eventually snaps. What if the Holocaust had happened differently than it did? What if the scale was smaller? What if the Nazi regime had chosen a different path? Or if their plans had been stopped sooner? Would the world have responded differently or still turned a blind eye? Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany systematically murdered 6 million Jews, along with millions of others. Roma people, disabled individuals, Poles, Soviet prisoners, and more. It remains one of the most horrific documented genocides in human history. But what if things had unfolded differently? Imagine a scenario where the Nazis were stopped earlier, maybe before the final solution was fully implemented. Perhaps they fell from power in the late 1930s, or maybe international pressure forced them to abandon the death camps. In that version of history, millions of lives would have been spared. Entire communities, art, culture, families would still exist. On the other hand, what if the genocide had been less systematic, more hidden, or slower to unfold? Would the world have even recognized it as genocide? Would justice have been served at Nuremberg, or would the crimes have been downplayed? A smaller scale Holocaust might not have sparked the same international reckoning. There might be no universal declaration of human rights, no genocide convention, no clear global consensus on what genocide is or how to respond to it. Without the full horror of the Holocaust, the creation of Israel might have been delayed or denied. Modern Germany might have not gone through the same process of historical reckoning. The world might have been slower to say never again. The Holocaust happened as history records it, brutal, vast, and real. But imagining a different version, even a lesser one, reminds us how quickly silence and inaction can enable atrocities. History is not just about what happened, it's about the choices we make when it starts to happen. Like things that have happened within the last 5 years. What if Japan had never attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941? No surprise attack. No day that will live in infamy. Would the U.S. have stayed out of World War II? Would the Axis powers have won? By late 1941, the U.S. and Japan were already on tense terms. Japan was expanding aggressively through Asia, and the U.S. had responded with economic sanctions, including a critical oil embargo. Japan viewed this as a threat to its survival and struck Pearl Harbor to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and buy time to dominate the Pacific. But what if Japan hadn't attacked? Suppose Tokyo chose diplomacy, delay, or a different military target. Without the shock of Pearl Harbor, American public opinion might have remained divided. FDR would have struggled to convince Congress to enter the war. Meanwhile, Hitler still invades the Soviet Union. Britain keeps fighting alone in Europe and the US. Maybe it continues sending weapons and aid, but doesn't commit troops. World War II becomes a drawn-out battle without the full might of American industry and manpower. Without US involvement, the Axis might have had more time to consolidate power. Britain could have fallen. The Soviet Union may have been overwhelmed. The Holocaust might have continued unchecked. The atomic bomb could have never been built, or been built by Germany first. And in Asia, Japan might have carved out a permanent empire in the Pacific, dominating China and Southeast Asia, free from American intervention. Pearl Harbor pulled the sleeping giant into the fight and changed the course of history. Without it, World War II might have ended very differently, or not ended at all. It's a sobering reminder of how one attack on one morning reshaped the entire world. What if D-Day had failed? What if the disaster? No Allied breakthrough? No liberation of France? What would that mean for World War II and the world that followed? D-Day was Allies' bold attempt to open a Western front and liberate Nazi-occupied Europe. Over 150,000 troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, facing fortified German defenses, rough seas, and immense risk. It worked, but just barely. If German forces had repelled the invasion or inflicted catastrophic losses, the outcome could have been drastically different. In this timeline, D-Day is a failure. The beaches are lost, thousands more Allied soldiers die or are captured, morale crumbles. Hitler tightens his grip on Western Europe. Stalin's Soviet forces continue pushing from the east, but without Western pressure, the Nazis can concentrate their defenses. It might take another year or more for the Allies to regroup, if ever, and in that time, millions more could die in concentration camps, on the battlefield, or under occupation. A failed D-Day might have meant a divided Europe, but not the way it happened in our timeline. The Soviets could have pushed further west, maybe even taking all of Germany, France, and beyond. The Iron Curtain might have stretched to the Atlantic. The US and Britain would still have nuclear capabilities, but a Cold War could have started earlier and been far more intense. Western democracy may not have survived in Europe at all. D-Day was a gamble, one that changed the world. If it had failed, history might have belonged to tyranny. The cost of failure would have been unimaginable. But it didn't, and the bravery of those who stormed the beaches that day remain one of the most decisive moments in the fight for freedom. What if the Cold War had turned hot? What if the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union had exploded into all-out war? Not just spies and proxy battles, but tanks, missiles, and nuclear fire. From the late 1940s to the early 1900s, the US and USSR waged a global power struggle without ever firing directly at each other. But they came close. Cuba, 1962. Berlin, 1948. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, every crisis risked boiling over into a full-scale war. And with both sides armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, the stakes were nothing short of apocalyptic. In this timeline, the Cold War goes hot. Maybe it's a misread radar alert, a misfired missile, or an invasion of Berlin that spirals out of control. Either way, conventional war breaks out and quickly escalates. Cities are obliterated. NATO and Warsaw Pact forces clash across Europe. Within days, nuclear weapons could be launched, not just once, but in waves. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction kicks in. Moscow, Washington, London, Beijing, gone. Billions die. Best case scenario, a shattered Earth choked by radioactive fallout and nuclear winter. Survivors struggle in a world without infrastructure, sunlight, or civilization. Worst case, humanity doesn't survive at all. Not even a limited war, say in Europe or Asia, would have redefined the 20th century. No internet, no global economy, no end to the arms race, just a world paralyzed by fear, division, and the fallout of what once was. The Cold War stayed cold, barely, but imagining what might have happened if it hadn't, that's a reminder of just how thin the line between history and annihilation really was, and maybe still is. Guys and gals, if y'all have gotten this far, thank you very much. I appreciate you listening to every single one of my videos. It really touches my heart. And if you love deep dives into history's biggest what-ifs, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because trust me, we've got a lot more coming.